Tonight's session is about becoming whole. And the reason that's such an important topic is because, as I have learned, and as we're going to talk about some tonight, the restoration to sanity that the second step promises is not limited to sobriety and getting clean. It's a promise to be made whole, ultimately, through the 12 steps, which is kind of what this whole deal is about. Tonight, we're going to focus on 6 and 7, step 6 and 7, which I consider to be the linchpins, and I'll explain why that is when we get there. I'm going to encourage you to take notes because I always encourage people to take notes because the evidence, I do a lot of research related stuff, the evidence says you'll learn a lot more if you take notes. So take notes. So there you go, a plug for note taking. Let me start this way. When I arrived at AA, I believed I was bad trying to get good. And that if I could just improve my behavior, namely my drinking, but all the other stuff, the problem would be solved. When I arrived in the rooms of recovery, they told me that I was actually sick trying to get well. That's a big change. But even that was just a temporary framework. What I eventually discovered is that the purpose of recovery in the 12 steps is not to be simply restored, but to find conscious contact. That in fact, my problem is I was spiritually asleep, desperately in need of awakening, and that the purpose of the 12 steps was to open up a channel through me so power could flow and I could be restored in all the ways possible. So let me take that and walk you through the steps, because if you didn't see the previous 2 sessions, I have a different way of talking about the steps. And so here's how I think of them. I start with step 0. This shit's got to stop, right? Sick and tired of being sick and tired, hopeless and futility of life as we've been living it, so fed up that we're willing to do anything. And in fact, the people who taught me step 0 told me that you can't get to step 1 without a step 0. Because the willingness is not there. If you don't understand how bad the problem is, you don't need the solution. So step 1 then proposes this heretical idea that the problem is you got no power and no promise of power. The program does not say that you are going to be made to be a powerful human being. It says you got no power and that's why you're here. Steps 2 and 3, in short, say there is power. That's it. 2 and 3 say there is power. The fun thing about the way I've worked with this is it doesn't seem to matter what you believe about power. And frankly, it doesn't seem to care what you believe either, whatever it is. That's why atheists get sober and agnostics get sober and Baptists get sober and Quakers get sober and Buddhists get sober and you name it. So it doesn't matter what the power is. What matters is our access to power. So steps 4 and 5, and this is literally right out of the big book, are designed to address the things that block us off from power. Ultimately, steps 4 and 5 are not an inventory of what rotten human beings we are, although every one of us gets to go through that with our early inventories. Eventually, 4 and 5 become the way that we identify the blocks within us that keep power from flowing, and it is power that restores us. 6 and 7, which we're going to dive into tonight, are the letting go steps. Having identified where we're blocked off in 6 and 7, we basically say, all right, I need to be done with this stuff. And again, we'll talk more about that. 8 and 9 are where we live an amended life ultimately, which is to be different than we were before because our insides are being made different, made right. To amend means change, not merely to say, I'm sorry. Doesn't mean we won't have to make a lot of traditional amends along the way. I still get to make a lot of things right day in and day out, despite 35 years of working this deal one day at a time. Step 10 is a monitoring step that takes us back to steps 4 through 9 and does it over and over again, either with an on-the-fly inventory in the evening, in the morning, etc. 11 is a conscious contact step. And if you read the book, you're going to find out that I actually put step 11 back before steps 4 and 5. Because thinking it's like, well, if we need power, let's start plugging into power just as early as we can before we even take on that difficult 4th and 5th step. And then 12 is what I refer to as the blossoming step. Or originally, we start trying to work it, but but eventually it works us and we begin to blossom. So let me go back to what I said that got me started on this. That's my summary of how I see the steps working progressively. So I arrived at AA thinking that I was bad trying to get good. You, dear people, told me I was sick trying to get well, which was true enough. But eventually the problem was revealed that I was spiritually asleep at the wheel, that I was blocked off from the spiritual realm, and that the purpose of the steps was to identify the blocks within me so they could be removed or addressed, so the power could flow, so I could be restored. And the promise I'm going to offer to you all as we go through this is the restoration does not appear to be limited. I'm 35 years in, I'm still being restored to sanity in ways that I've needed all along, and in many cases just didn't know it. So I'm sure you all probably know that 6 and 7 use language like character defects and shortcomings. And I would just as soon pitch those words out because I think they're the voice of trauma and shame. And I do not find trauma and shame to be helpful at all. Call them maladaptions, call them whatever you would like. It really doesn't matter to me. But part of the reformation that we need is to stop seeing ourselves as broken. Brokenness is tantamount to shame. We carry it deep within us. And so 6 and 7 use those words, and that's okay. If you use those words, go right ahead. I got no issue with you using them. I've just reframed them for my purposes. So let me tell you how I think of 6 and 7 today, and then I'm going to tell you how I've experienced them. I refer to them as letting go steps today. So up until 4 and 5, I'm identifying the stuff that blocks me off. 6 and 7 is where I begin the letting go process so they can be addressed, removed, modified, changed, whatever needs to be done with them. And there's a letting go activity that takes on. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. Some of you probably know the book Drop the Rock. Looks like this. Drop the rock. That's letting go, right? It's like that. Well, that's the idea of letting go, is that 6 and 7 oftentimes for me is reaching the place where I no longer want to hold on to the things in which I am stuck. And the amazing thing to me is they go pretty readily when I'm done with them, but they don't go until I'm done with them. So letting go, drop the rock. Somebody recently mentioned to me that Pema Chodron, the great Buddhist teacher, Shambhalian teacher, refers to steps 6 and 7 as the let be steps, which is a whole new way. I just learned this like a few weeks ago, to let be. And that's important. Let me start talking now about my experience with the 7th step. When I first started my recovery and started on steps 6 and 7, I totally biffed these steps. I thought the step said, humbly asked him to help me remove my shortcomings. There's a big problem there. That means that I think the program is a self-help program. It is not a self-help program. If I could help myself, I wouldn't need you people. I wouldn't need those steps, and I wouldn't need a higher power. So my suffering around 6 and 7, which is exactly what happened, because I used every bit of will that I had to try and fix myself, to try and change my behavior, try and change my personality, to stop acting out. And I failed so often. And you know what? I'm sure some of you have this experience. I mean, one of the ones that I've talked about before, and I'll continue to talk about because it was pivotal, was well into sobriety. Starting 7, 8 years sober, I had a couple of stepdaughters at that point, and I could not stop emotionally abusing them. I couldn't stop. I mistreated them. And I'd say I'd do better and I'd fail. And I'd say I'd do better and I'd fail. And I'd do a 4th step and I'd fail. And I'd pray and I'd fail. And I'd talk about it in a meeting and people would tell me, just try harder. And I would try harder and I would fail. And it broke me. It absolutely broke me. I knew better but was unable to do better despite my best intentions, despite a program of recovery, despite two therapists. Yes, I had one for me and one for the family. I needed a lot of help, despite a sponsor, despite a spiritual advisor. I couldn't get done with a behavior that I so wanted to be done with. Well, it turns out that mistreating those two girls was only a symptom of what needed addressing. It's kind of like when you think about 6 and 7, it's like praying for God to remove a fever, when in fact the problem is that you've got bacteria in your gut. We ask for the wrong things because we see the behaviors. We don't understand what blocks us off. So when I was finally able to start looking really deeply at what blocked me off and what kept me from mistreating my daughters, by the way, one of the reasons I talk about this is because I know I am not the only person in longer term recovery who mistreated people in their lives. It's actually fairly common, though we don't talk about it very commonly because it sounds like we're not well. Well, I don't know if we're well or not, but we do mistreat people. It's a fairly common thing that we don't talk much about. And so I'm just sharing that because perhaps it will make it okay for you all to also know that you struggle as I have. Well, it turns out that I was mistreating those girls because I was trapped in a relationship and circumstance in which I could not win. I married a beautiful woman, lots of good things to be said about her, the wrong person for me. And day in and day out, I was under relational stress. And day after day, that stress had to go somewhere. And since I didn't drink and didn't drug, and I had given up tobacco, which was my other go-to, which was really hard to get rid of, that stress had to go somewhere. And that stress went at those two girls. Now, some people have told me, it's like, well, Ron, that's a cop-out. If you'd just tried harder. Well, all I got to say about that is I almost committed suicide because I couldn't talk. I couldn't stop mistreating them because I was suffering so terribly. And so eventually steps 6 and 7 had to move far beyond my bad behavior. And I will own that it was bad behavior, and I've owned it with both those girls. I had to burrow down beneath into what the big book calls causes and conditions. That's where the 6th and 7th step needed to go. I didn't need to change my behavior because that's just on the outside. It's just like drinking is but a symptom of our problem. What I needed spiritual help with was the fact that I felt so inept. I felt so lost. I felt like such a failure in that relationship that it came out sideways as mistreatment of those girls. So eventually, where that led to, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, I got more to say about 6 and 7. Where it led to was divorcing their mom. The amend was to get out of the relationship. I got out of the relationship, and with a little bit of effort, a lot of effort over a lot of time, the relationship with those girls got made right. The behavior that I struggled with began to go away because the stuff on the inside that was causing it was finally being addressed. So you probably say to yourself, well, how in God's name or how in the hell does one get at that stuff? Well, this is why I call this the lynchpin, and why I started off telling you that my primary problem at first was I thought step 6 and 7 and the 12 steps were a self-help program. What I didn't realize was that I was beyond human aid. It actually says that in how it works, that no human power could relieve our alcoholism. And in this case, I'm including these personality problems, these behavioral problems as part of that alcoholism. No human power. I can't fix me. You can't fix me. A therapist can't fix me. Those girls can't fix me. That wife couldn't fix me. There was no good sponsor couldn't fix me. The fix was beyond human means, which is why we desperately need this 6 and 7, which is why I call it the lynchpin today. And in fact, step 7 has become my favorite step. So let me tell you a little bit more about how and what I learned by way of that. What I ended up discovering about 6 and 7 is that since I had inventoried the symptoms, I had to go back to inventory to understand what the big book calls causes and conditions, the stuff underlying the behavior. And that took multiple iterations. And I sure hope you people don't have to do as many fourth steps as I had to do, but you might. I don't know. And I certainly hope you don't need. I mean, I'm up to like 20 years of therapy at this point. It's been really, really good. But I sure hope you all don't have to go down that. And I had to have trauma treatment because it turns out that some of that underlying damage that I was trying to get out from under was actually damage back to my own childhood. So the restorative work had to go back and deal with my own childhood traumas, which were being projected out on those two girls. And I had no idea I was going to have to do that work. Now, lots of us will say, well, I didn't have a terrible childhood. Well, there's a whole lot of denial that a lot of us have about our families and family systems. And I'm sure some of you you've heard a lot about this because of your association with Pavillon. The funny thing is that it wasn't until 17 years sober when I went in for inpatient treatment for trauma that I finally understood that I had been acting stuff out because of things that were far, far in my past. And in fact, I would argue that it was those underlying traumas, that underlying dysfunction that was at the root of the alcohol that I so desperately needed. And the food, yes, I had a food problem. And the tobacco, yes, I had a tobacco addiction. How in the world I didn't get a drug addiction or gambling addiction, or those others, I don't know. But so what I had to do was I had to use 6 and 7 to throw me back into 4 and 5 over and over again to try and get at the root causes. And I did need a therapist, and I did need a really good sponsor who knew how to do this work. And I did have to continue to do those inventories. At some point, what became clear to me was that I needed some more powerful prayers because just asking for help didn't seem to be getting the job done. So I acquired a couple of really useful prayers for me. One of the prayers was to start asking for my unwillingness to be revealed to me. Flip the coin, flip the coin over, and rather than praying for willingness, pray for the unwillingness to be revealed to me. Well, it turns out that part of my unwillingness was my own sense of my own brokenness that had to go, had to be healed. I was deeply attached to being a broken human being. We hear this in the rooms all the time. People talking trash about themselves, about how they feel about themselves. And so that stuff had to go. Another prayer that had to be added, this is the one I consider my most potent prayer that I have used, oh man, for a long time. It's the one I most recommend. It goes like this. Please take this from me. Or if it can't be taken from me for some reason, please show me whatever I need to see, feel, or learn so something can be changed in me. I don't want this anymore. So I'm going to repeat that. Please take this from me. Or, by the way, you can say God or not God. I'm pretty sure it doesn't matter. I mean, higher power, progressive power, Abba, Yahweh, whatever. Please take this from me. And if it can't be taken from me, show me whatever I need to see, feel, and learn so that it can be altered, changed within me, or removed from me. The reason I think that is so powerful is because my conclusion about 6 and 7 is that until I see it clearly enough that I no longer want it, there is no letting go. There is no letting go. In fact, here's a conundrum for you. The big book, which many of you I'm sure are students of, does not use the word surrender in the first 164 pages. That is amazing given how much we talk about surrender. It is not in the basic text of the big book. What is in the basic text of the big book is the word abandon. So that is a really important difference. Surrender is trying to let go of something that I don't want to let go of, which is why I hear so often in the rooms and have heard myself say so often, I let it go and then I take it back. Well, that's because I still want it. I'll come back to talking about why that's important with regard to the work I had to do with those girls here in just a moment. Abandon looks like drop the rock. Abandon means I don't find any value in it anymore and I don't want it anymore. Therefore, it can be taken or altered or modified in me. So the reason that is hugely important is that until I reach, there's a line actually, and there is a solution in the big book. Until I have seen the hopelessness and futility of life as I have been living it, I can't pick up that simple kit of spiritual tools. I don't give up anything till I'm cornered. And the better and clearer I can get on how it is I'm cornered, the better I will be at reaching the jumping off point for step 7. So I'm going to tell you a really, really cool example of this. When I was really hammering through this stuff, and at least one of you has heard this story a few times, so you're going to hear it again. I couldn't figure out how it could be that an obsession to drink could be removed from me, and these other things I was seemingly stuck with. And man, I hammered away at that. Turns out that the founders of AA struggled with the same thing. They saw that, a problem like alcohol or drugs could be remedied, so why not other things, in short? So I had a terrible, terrible, terrible problem with badgering my now ex-wife. And if you met her, she's a wonderful human being. I got nothing negative to say about her. I wouldn't want you to think it has something to do with her. She's fully herself. I was so twisted up that I badgered her nonstop for a very, very long time, years. And it always went badly. Badgering because I needed her to try and be different because I was so stuck. Well, I suffered around that because I knew how much damage I was doing to her and to me. And I was doing this inventory work related to those girls. I was doing this inventory, a lot of 7-step work. And one day, out of the blue, my head hit the pillow right beside her. And I saw the thought in my mind, this shit doesn't work. Badgering has never worked. It always fails. All it does is hurt her, and then I feel guilty. I don't want this anymore. That was 25 years ago, and that badgering has been gone ever since. Like that. Just the same way my alcoholism stopped. Like that. Which is, we call that a miracle. Well, the way I think of that today is I'd finally reached that jumping off place where I was willing to let go of it. But I'd finally seen that it was not serving me. And in fact, it was causing a lot of damage. And the fact that it vanished on the spot was the moment that told me there was something more to this 7th step than I had imagined. Because that kind of a behavioral change shouldn't happen. But the outside behavior was a symptom of the inside believing that if I could just badger her enough, she would finally do the things I needed her to do so I wouldn't feel so badly about myself. And that has happened on other occasions. It's actually how I got done with tobacco, going back a few years. So the benefit of this 7, even the suffering we go through trying to self-improve is beneficial because it helps us get to the jumping off place, the place where we finally see the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it, and then we are finally ready to let go. And once we're ready to let go, it can be taken from us, which is like a really amazing thing. And it explains a lot about how anybody like me, or perhaps some of you, could get sober. So what is that stuff that's down underneath the behavior? Hopefully you now are at least leaning into the idea that it's not about the behavior. We're not just trying to get good. There's something deep down inside of us that is blocking us off from power. Well, there's a couple of really profound things about this. What we've learned about trauma, which I've mentioned earlier, for people in recovery is pretty profound. And that trauma for most of us was in the first 7 years of life. And I'm not talking about, your mother being blown up beside you in a car. For many of us, the trauma was being told what a lousy, rotten shit you were 10,000 times by the age of 3. It was every time that a woman is told she's fat, she's ugly, she's stupid, she'll amount to nothing, she's nothing but a whore. Do that enough times, it traumatizes. The same thing that happens to a little boy who's told he's worthless, that'll never amount to anything, that he's a nasty little boy, that he's stupid. That's traumatizing behavior. It's called abuse. And for many of us, it was so normalized, that or the neglect or the abandonment, that we didn't really even know it was happening to us. And so we come into recovery and it's like, no, I had a normal childhood, not knowing that there's a history of trauma. So what we've learned about trauma is pretty profound. There's actually a chapter in the book about that. And there's lots we can learn about that. Bill Wilson said something really profound. I just discovered this just recently. He wrote a piece in 1957 where he said the purpose of the moral inventory is to discover how we were damaged by life. So let me repeat that. That's pretty profound. Here's a guy who's, at that point, 20 however many years sober, saying that the purpose of the inventory is not to list all the ways we're crappy human beings, but to help us see how we got damaged by life. Well, that's because what needs to be done in step 7 is the damage inside of us has to be remediated. So step 7 is about remediating damage, our maladaptions. And then recently someone turned me on to a piece by Oprah, of all people. Everybody knows Oprah. Well, there's a news clip, and you all can find it if you want. And it's really great. It's about a book. And the punchline of the book is, it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. It's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So what we're looking for in this step 7, supported by this step 4 and 5, is to find out what the damage is inside of us so the damage can get addressed by a higher power, perhaps by therapy. I've already said a lot about that. We've been warped by these life experiences, and what we need is the opportunity not to get unwarped, but for things to be made right. I have to tell you, the past 5 years, I've been doing a remarkable amount of dream work. That is a whole nother conversation. But I actually had a really powerful dream one day, and I was in a home, and they say that the home is representative of us. So if you dream of a home, you're dreaming about yourself, about the you, the structure of you. And there was a contractor in the house who was taking sheetrock down, and we found that the core of the house was warped. So the dream showed me that the core of the house was warped. But then the message in the dream was the warping was fine. The point was not to unwarp me. The point was to normalize it, to make it okay, to heal, to be restored, to become whole despite warping, which is really a powerful thing. What it means is you don't have to undo all the things that got done. As has been said to me, the relationship with this higher power isn't about the higher power, it's about the relationship with the higher power. And the blocks in my eyes, as the scriptures would say, are these things I hold to be true about myself. My longtime sponsor, Sam, used to say that this stuff runs through us like the stain runs through marble. And of course, the beauty of that analogy is that marble, once polished up and cleaned up, it is the stain that runs through the marble that is the source of its beauty. So who you are is beautiful. It's just not the relationship with it that you have. So that introduces something that I talk a lot about in 6 and 7. We do a lot of assets or strengths inventory because it turns out that most of us have a very poor self-perception, and some part of 7-step work is we need some new information about ourselves. One framework, commercial product called Strengths. You can do a product called Strengths Finder. And what it can help us see is that how we've come together, who we are, can either elevate us or take us down. And when we arrive into recovery, we've been taken down. But the same stuff, things like, I love some of these. I've been talking with people for years about this. So for example, somebody who is really controlling, which is a pretty common quote unquote character defect, actually proves to be extremely responsible quite often. Being responsible is a great character trait, but it was taken to the dark side, it becomes controlling behavior. So we change our relation to realize it's like controlling people have great responsibility quite often. Someone who is perfectionistic or hypercritical is oftentimes extremely attentive to things, sees a lot of things other people don't see, and has a low tolerance for it. So all of a sudden, you take a perfectionist and you ask them to do something that involves seeing things clearly, and they can do remarkable things. So it turns out this character defect is in fact an asset that has been or become damaging. Some of us, this is a favorite one because I'm one of these, and you can probably figure this out as soon as I say it. Some of us were accused from day one of recovery that we needed to stop thinking so hard, that we overthought everything. And that is absolutely true about me. But here's the beauty. It made me cry. The whole basis for my professional practice, the whole basis for this book, this body of work, the stuff we're talking about here, is because, yeah, I overthink, but I got a really good thinker. And trying to not think is like asking me not to be a guy, not to be a human, not to be 5'9". I have a really, really good thinker. But I was so damaged by the idea that there was something wrong with the way I think. And in fact, my first sponsor told me I would have about as much luck stopping my thinker as I did stopping drinking. He was right. So I had to change my relationship to this. So part of this 7-step remediation work is taking a good hard look. You can do this through the classic assets inventory. I'm a really big fan of Al-Anon's blueprints for progress, which was actually the first inventory I took because I came in through Al-Anon for adult children before I discovered I had a drinking problem. And what the Blueprints book will take you through, the Al-Anon book, it will take you through this really rigorous inventory of looking hard at yourself, where things went awry and where things went right, what it says about you that's problematic and what it says about you, things that are really, really brilliant. And so there's this whole different way of beginning to look at ourselves, because here's why this is so cool. I'm just going to use my example. So if I can shift from thinking that God needs to fix my overthinking to being grateful for having a good thinker, the problem's gone. Let me repeat that. If my perception can change from critiquing myself for overthinking to realizing that my thinkery, this good thinker, is a tremendous asset to be utilized, I no longer have a problem that needs solving. That's a reformation. It's a complete change in the relationship of myself to my understanding of myself. And literally, that is what has happened to me. I now, for those of you who know me well and follow me much in social media, you'll know this because you find out that I'll put up a post at 2:15 in the morning that says something about how I had plans for sleeping in, but my thinker, the fates, higher power, had plans for me. So I'm up and I'm working on stuff because that's what works when that stuff is happening. but I no longer negativize it. I no longer see it as a flaw. I understand that it is intrinsic to my nature, and it has produced incredible benefits. This year in the pandemic, with those kinds of things going on, has been the most fruitful year of my recovery. I'm going to repeat that. These past 15 months, actually 489 days, because I have been deep in my practice for 489 days, in my journal, in my meditations, has been the most fruitful of all my 35 years in recovery. Because when you go deeply enough, this stuff starts getting made right, which is really a remarkable thing. And I'm going to come back around to it again. Lots of us need therapeutic support. Lots of us need therapeutic support. The only thing I want to add to this before I put a little bit of a wrap on things is you cannot practice enough self-care. For those of us who have been neglected, abused, including by ourselves, lots of us self-neglect and self-abuse. You all know that. Some of you know that. Self-care, 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 self-care. It's an act of self-love, and an act of self-love is not self-centeredness. It's an act of healing directed at ourselves. So whatever makes you feel good. For me, it's become gardens and art. I don't know why. Gardens and art restore me. So I spend a lot of time in gardens and with art. In fact, I've become an artist. So the point is, if we're looking for wholeness, wholeness is a promise that everything can be restored. And I'm willing to say everything, because that so far is my experience. It will ask me to do a lot. I want to tell a quick story about someone else, because I just had this experience, I guess it was just last week. A young woman I think she's 7 years in recovery. A young woman, 7 years in recovery, started approaching me. And she was pretty tormented by her relationship to herself, which basically, for all intents and purposes, is a fairly common one we hear of ultimately self-hatred, self-loathing, all those sorts of things. And we started doing some of this work. And what she told me just one day last week was that something had profoundly shifted in her. Now, she's exactly the same person she was, but something about her relationship to herself had allowed her to stop beating on herself. That's a big deal, because a lot of us beat up on ourselves a lot. Hence the line, if other people treated me the way I treat myself, I'd have to kill them. So again, just one more indicator of a tremendous change within us. My conclusion today, and we'll be happy to chat a little bit in a few minutes. My conclusion today about the seventh step is that it relates today in my mind to a line on page 164 of the big book. Abandon yourself. I actually put a space in there. Abandon yourself, abandon your attachments to yourself, to God as you understand God. That's a critical phrase in the Road of Happy Destiny. Page 164, A Vision for You, is letting go of ourselves, letting go of these damages, letting go of our toxic relationships to ourselves, letting go of these perceptions of who we are that are false and twisted, is an integral part of being on the road of happy destiny, which is a really, really remarkable thing. I could tell you story after story after story about people who have been restored. The reason that's important is because the line that precedes, having seen the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it, is a line that says, because we saw that it worked in others. So we saw that it worked in others. We had seen the hopelessness and futility of life as we've been living it. And that brings us to the stepping off place, the launching spot, the time when we can finally let go of something because we believe something might work. And we are just so fed up with what we've been doing that we're willing to let it go. And then just this closing thought. The beauty of this process, It's going to sound a little bit funny, but the beauty of this process is that if it hasn't been let go yet, it means you have more inventory work to do. It's like beautiful, right? I mean, you'll know you've finally nailed it when it's lifted from you. And if it hasn't been lifted from you, if it hasn't been altered, if it hasn't changed for you, then it's like, okay, all right, I've just got some more inventory work to do, which is like a perfect diagnostic system. The reason I talk about this stuff today, and I was alluding to it a little bit, is because the degree of restoration in me that I experienced today is, I don't know what word to use. I could not even conceive of what has been made right in me. And I'm not for a moment going to tell you that I'm a perfect human being. Those of you who know me know that's not true. But the restoration is a really remarkable thing. And the seventh step is a linchpin in that. So I'll close with this thought. The only question I want you to hold is, if it's not done with me and I'm not done with it, what is it that I don't yet see that would cause me to keep clinging to it? If it's not done with me or I'm not done with it, what is it that I still value in it that causes me to still cling to this? That is an extremely valuable line of inquiry. So I'm really looking forward to what you folks have to say. We'll use the chat box, et cetera, and let's do this. Let's have a conversation. Okay, I'm done now.
Thank you, Ron. Let's open this up.
So I can use the chat box. There was an earlier one, Oprah and Dr. Oh, there's a link in the chat box. For those of you who may be listening to this later and won't see the chat, it's actually a talk called What Happened to You by Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry. It's his book that they're talking about. So you can Google Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry to find out what happened to you. And then there's another, there's a point in here, somebody says, more inventory with 4 question marks? Yeah, that's my experience. I would, what's different though is that it tends to become a different kind of inventory. I'm looking for something different and I may need some help with that. By the way, in the book, there's a guide to a different way to do the inventory. So, and I'll drop some links in here in just a moment. And I also have a handout from today that includes the chapter from the book. So somebody asked, can you repeat the prayer one more time, please? Yes. Please take this from me. This is the 7th step prayer as I now practice it today. Please take this from me. Or if it can't be taken, please show me what I need to see, feel, and learn so it can be altered or taken. And that is actually in the 7th step, 6th and 7th step chapter of the book. And I'm going to actually post a copy of the chapter here in just a moment. But first, I'm going to drop some links in here so you all can find this stuff. There it is. Yeah, so there's the previous 2 workshops are at that link. So you can just click on that link and you can find the workshops. They're on my site, but they go straight through to the Pavillon site. There's a link there to find the book. And so you can click on that and find the book. And then there's a link here to the Progressive Recovery course that we developed if you have an interest. So you can click on any of those. And I've been asked to put my email address in here. So I will. Whoops, if I can type. There it is, ron@ronaldchapman.com. So Michelle has just repeated back the prayer, please take this from me. And if it can't be taken, please show me what I need to see, feel, or learn so it can be taken. Let me drop a file in here now, if I can find it real quickly, because I actually made a copy of the chapter plus a few additions so that you all could have this piece because it's specifically related to tonight's conversation. Outline, oops, wrong one. There we go. So there is now a handout in the chat box that you can click or double click on, and it should download onto your computer. And I know last time we had a little trouble with this downloading. So Katie, part of what Leslie had to do last time was figure out how to get it to people who couldn't get at it. We never did figure out why that was. Speaking of trauma, can it be self-inflicted or does it have to come from others? For most of us, it gets started. They used to call this toxic or toxic stress. Mostly self-inflicted trauma is learned. The exception I would provide for are things that we don't understand well, like, for example, autism. But mostly it's happened to us. The language that Pia Melody uses, somebody has posted a link to The Wisdom of Trauma, a movie. What Pia Melody says, Pia Melody is in recovery from more things than most of us know we need to recover from. And she started the Meadows Treatment Center in Arizona, which specializes specifically in trauma. And what she says about that is that if you are neglected, abused, abandoned, or betrayed, that you likely were traumatized as a result of it. In my case, it was neglect. And there's a lot of that stuff that we just can't see in our own lives because we don't realize it happened. So what I had to learn along the way was that because I had experienced a lot of neglect, I was really good at self-neglect. I had learned to neglect because it was familiar to me. So what a lot of us have to do, there's a couple of really good books. One of them is called Escape from Intimacy. I guess I should type this in here. Escape from Intimacy, which talks a lot about how this stuff messes up our attachments with primary caregivers. Intimacy, Escape from Intimacy. I forget the author, but another resource that you can find out more about this traumatic effect. And of course, most of you know Gabor Mate, who does a whole bunch of stuff about, you can just Google his name. He's got an endless amount of material about trauma and the effects it has on us. He's the guy, I think he was the original one, or he's one who's really talked a lot about the opposite of addiction is connection. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about that thought, because if that were simply true, then just having friends would be a cure for addiction. So something about that is a little different than perhaps we think about it. But Gabor Mate has written a lot about trauma. So I'm happy to see more comments in the chat box, or if someone would like to, you can unmute yourself.
Ron, Fred, an alcoholic.
Yes, Fred.
Your prayer. You know, I always feel that prayer. My prayer is always of thanks. I never ask my higher power. I should say, never ask. I don't ask my higher power for things because I'm setting myself up for expectations, and expectations can eventually lead to disappointments. Mm-hmm. So if I'm asking my higher power or God to take things from me, or show me, what I need to see, feel, and learn, am I not setting myself up for an expectation that I could possibly fail?
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think there's a couple of things that I want to add to that, though. What I learned about my 7th step, Fred, was all of that frustration was part of hitting bottom with those things. And that proved to be very, very beneficial. Frustration, difficulty, exasperation, those are actually gifts that show us that we're not finished yet. And then the other piece is, this is going to sound kind of heretical, but I actually think that prayer is about my willingness and has nothing to do with higher power. I think it's a prayer of willingness is how I see it today, Fred. Does that make any sense?
I'll have to mull that through my head. Thanks, Ron.
Yeah, but I don't want to deny it. Certainly sets up expectation and can be very frustrating. That is absolutely true.
I'll process it through my thinker.
Good. The fact that you asked that question tells me you have a good thinker, because only a good thinker would produce that question. So congratulations, you've got a tool. There's a note in here, I can be very impatient sometimes. Is there a positive way to reframe being an impatient person the same way you did with being controlling or being a perfectionist? Yeah, absolutely. Impatience is very common to people who are achievers. Thomas Edison was an incredibly impatient man. He was also the greatest inventor the Western world has ever known. So perhaps the thing to say about it is if we can learn how to be with our impatience, perhaps we can let it be the ally that it could be, and perhaps we can relax into it and let it be a strength or an asset. That's the one that immediately comes to mind. There's probably other ways. If others have ideas about how their impatience actually really does serve them well, I mean, drop it in the chat box. We can all learn from each other. I don't want to pretend to be the only person who knows things.
I'm going to hop in really quickly for the 5-minute warning,
Okay.
but we also will be around, Ron will be around for 15 minutes for the meeting. After the meeting, just know that he has a commitment at 8:15. So that's just a heads up on that, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah. So what that means is we're just going to we're going to officially talk for 5 more minutes, and then we're going to unofficially shoot the shit thereafter. So let's see. A couple more items in the chat box. Somebody mentions we should add some of these books to the Pavillon bookstore. Which steps are most helpful when pertaining to trauma? Boy, that is an outstanding question. I think as I eventually learned to practice it, it has been immensely valuable in column 4 of the 4th step to understand what I'm bringing to things. But the other piece that I have to acknowledge is how powerful it is in the 11th step. I have learned how to use breath work to be with the discomfort of my trauma. And what's amazing is when we stop running from the trauma, which is what meditation allows us to do, is to stay present to what's going on in our own body. It begins to lose its power and things begin to heal. Some of my best recovery work has been sitting in stillness with that stuff. Sometimes crying pretty hard because, let's face it, that stuff is not pleasant sometimes. But the stuff healed as a result. So I would say column 4, the 4th step, and the 11th step, the meditation piece. Somebody else mentions efficiency is how impatience can be used. Yeah, that's true. I hadn't even thought about that one. That impatience would cause us to find a better way to get things done. So probably a lot of people who have improved things have had impatience. Oh, there's the handout again. I guess it came around again. Someone posted it again. So let's see if there's any other items in. Oh, it's a smaller PDF file. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. She must have compressed it. Let's see if there are any other items for the chat, and if not, we will let this thing wrap up in whatever our normal fashion is, Katie, and then we'll hang out and we can unmute and we can talk until 8:50.